This is the top of a 29-gallon guppy tank that I'm about to break down and clean, but before I do, I wanted to film it because there's a lot of interesting things happening at the top of this tank. The first one that I'd like to mention is this area right here because it's a big part of the reason why this tank needs some serious attention. This is cyanobacteria, sometimes incorrectly referred to as blue-green algae, and it's not something you want in your tank. The trouble all began because this tank receives a lot of light and nutrients, so hair algae took full advantage of that and began to grow around this floating piece of driftwood, which makes perfect sense because the driftwood is close to the light, and as it decomposes, it provides a steady source of nutrients for the hair algae to feed on. The growth of algae then spread from the driftwood to the moss and then everything else in its path. Eventually, the algae got so thick that it cut off the water movement and the oxygen to this part of the tank, and that's when the cyanobacteria appeared and began to grow. So I had to put an end to it before things got worse and it spread to the entire tank. And now let's take a quick look at the various plants that are at the surface of this guppy tank. This floating plant with the round leaves is called frogbit. This native of the Amazon is easy to grow, spreads quickly, and doesn't need crazy amounts of light to thrive. But it does need to be thinned out occasionally so that it doesn't stop all of the light from reaching the plants growing beneath it. And this is Ludwigia palustris. In bright light, it will grow right up and out of the water. And I'm not sure what type of moss this is, but it's also growing above the surface of the water. And finally, there's this unusual floating plant known as Asian watergrass. Asian watergrass needs bright light and high humidity in order to thrive, and it's the main reason why this tank is so brightly lit. Now that you're familiar with the various floating plants in this tank, let's move in a little closer and see what the guppies are up to. The guppies are doing what guppies do best, feeding at the surface and making lots and lots of babies. Unfortunately, the dense growth of plants at the top of this aquarium, along with all of the hair algae, has made it difficult for the guppies to move around in certain areas of this tank, which is just another reason why I'm making some changes. And now we'll zoom in a little closer to the surface and see what else is living in here. This piece of driftwood has lots of little animals on it known as springtails. You can't see them right now, but in a moment you will because I'm about to push down on the driftwood, which will force all of the springtails sitting on it to land in the water, at which point the springtails will jump around on the surface of the water until they find a new place to rest. That is, unless one of the guppies happens to eat it first, but the guppies better be quick because these springtails are really fast. Springtails are very common all over the world, and there are thousands upon thousands of different species living in a wide variety of different habitats. And they're sometimes seen as tiny little specks jumping around on the surface of the water in our aquariums, and they're especially common to see if you have floating plants. Springtails eat algae, mold, fish food, detritus, rotting plants, and anything else they can find. They need high humidity to survive, so the warm water in your fish tank combined with an aquarium cover and some floating plants provides a perfect habitat for a colony of springtails. Some people find them unsightly, but they look like nothing more than little specks of dust jumping around on the surface of the water, and I'd be willing to bet that many people have them and don't even realize that they're there. Nonetheless, once you have them in your aquarium, they are very difficult to get rid of. However, adult springtails need to remain in a humid environment and they dry out very easily, so a commonly recommended treatment is to use a hairdryer set on high to heat and completely dry the top part of the tank where they live. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple because their eggs sink in the water immediately after they lay them, so killing the adults at the surface doesn't really solve the problem, it just slows them down a little. And you wouldn't know it to look at him now, but this little springtail living at the surface of my aquarium is one of the fastest animals on the planet. But their speed is not in how fast they walk or run, because I think this little guy is at full speed right now. Their speed is in how fast they can spin when they jump. You see, globular springtails, such as the ones seen here, jump and then flip at over 375 rotations per second, or just over 22,000 RPM. And just to put that in perspective, a helicopter blade spins at about 500 RPM. So when this little guy jumps, he spins about 44 times faster than a helicopter blade. They're able to spin at such fast rates of speed because they're equipped with a remarkable spring-loaded escape device known as a furcula. The furcula is like a spring-loaded arm that rests under the abdomen, and when it's released, it catapults the springtail and sends it spinning through the air. There's a springtail right here, and it's getting ready to make one of its famous spinning jumps. First, we'll watch it at normal speed. It actually jumped 3 times, and you can't even tell that it was spinning. So, we'll now watch it at 1/10 of normal speed. It's still a blur, but you can now tell that it's spinning. It's hard to tell exactly what's happening here, but this is what it looks like to me. The springtail jumps and then lands in the water right here. Then it jumps again and lands in the water a second time, before jumping a third time and then finally landing on the leaf of the Asian watergrass. The springtail's spectacular spinning jumps are effective for escaping danger, but the springtail has little to no control over where it lands. And now that we know a little more about those tiny specks jumping around on the surface of the water, let's take a look at another creature that spends a lot of time at the top of the tank looking for food. I'm speaking, of course, of our friend the guppy, whose bottom lip protrudes more than the top lip, which makes them ideally suited for feeding at the surface of the water. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. We've looked at 3 types of organisms that are adapted for life at the surface. We looked at a few floating plants, the surface-dwelling springtails, and the surface-feeding guppies. Hopefully you've enjoyed this bird's eye view of this unusual guppy tank and even learned a thing or two along the way. Thanks for watching and have a spectacular day.